The wind never really stopped in Black Hollow. It howled across the plains like something alive, dragging dust through broken fences, rattling dry wood, whispering through the bones of a ranch that had once been full of life. To most folks passing through, it was just another stretch of forgotten land. But to Caleb Turner, it was everything he had left. Or maybe everything he had lost. Caleb stood at the edge of his property just before sunrise, boots planted in the cracked earth, his hat pulled low against the restless wind. The sky was pale and empty, the kind of empty that promised nothing, not rain, not mercy, not change. He squinted toward the horizon anyway. He always did, but nothing ever came. Behind him, the ranch sagged under the weight of neglect. The barn doors hung crooked, one hinge barely holding on. And the cattle were thin, too thin. Their ribs showed like warning signs, shifting slowly as they searched for grass that no longer grew. Caleb exhaled through his nose, slow and tired. Another day, he muttered. It wasn't hope, it was habit. A few years back, mornings used to feel different. There had been laughter in the air back then, warm bread cooling on the windowsill, a woman's voice calling him in from the fields. He shut his eyes. That was before the sickness came, before the doctor shook his head, before the house grew quiet in a way no man ever truly gets used to. Since then, Caleb had learned something. Hope was dangerous. It crept in soft, made promises it couldn't keep, and left you emptier when it was gone. So he stopped hoping, stopped praying too. At first, it had been anger. Now it was just silence. He turned back toward the house, boots crunching over dry dirt. The well bucket sat unused. No point hauling up what little muddy water remained. Not enough for crops, barely enough for survival. Inside, the place felt colder than the morning air. A single table, one chair, a tin plate left from last night's meal, if you could call it that. Beans, mostly. Always beans. Caleb poured himself coffee, black and bitter, staring at nothing while it cooled in his hands. Then his gaze shifted. The letter sat on the table where he'd left it, folded, reread too many times. He didn't reach for it right away, didn't want to, because touching it meant admitting something he wasn't ready to name. But after a long moment, he picked it up anyway. The paper was worn at the edges now, and the ink slightly smudged where his thumb had lingered too long the first time he read it. To Mr. Caleb Turner, regarding your request for a mail-order bride. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Bride, he said under his breath. That's a stretch. Truth was, he hadn't written that letter for love. He wrote it because the bank was closing in. Because a man alone couldn't keep a ranch running. Not like this. Not anymore. He needed help. Someone to cook, maybe tend what little could still grow. Someone to make the place look alive enough to buy him time. That was all. Or at least, that's what he told himself. His eyes drifted to the final line again. Arrival scheduled for Easter Sunday. Easter? Caleb's jaw tightened. He used to know what that day meant. Resurrection, renewal, second chances. And now it just felt like another word people used when they didn't have real answers. He folded the letter sharply and set it back down. Doesn't change anything, he muttered. Outside, the wind picked up again, slamming against the side of the house like it had something to prove. Caleb grabbed his hat and stepped back out into it. Work didn't wait, even when everything else had already given up. By midday, the sun burned high and merciless. Caleb worked in silence, repairing a section of fence that would likely break again by next week. Sweat ran down his back, mixing with dust, turning his shirt stiff and heavy. A neighbor rode by sometime in the afternoon, old Mr. Dawkins from the next ridge over. He slowed his horse just enough to call out, "Heard you're expecting company." Caleb didn't look up from the fence post he was hammering. It's word travels fast. Dawkins smirked. Town's got nothing better to do. A pause. You really think that's going to fix things? The old man asked. Caleb drove the nail in harder than necessary. I don't think anything fixes things, he replied flatly. Dawkins studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, like he understood more than he said. Easter's a strange time for things to change, he muttered before nudging his horse forward again. Stranger things have happened. Caleb didn't respond, didn't watch him leave, didn't need to, because he already knew how this story went. Nothing changes. People just convince themselves it will. That evening, the sky turned a dull gray, clouds stretching thin and useless across the horizon. Caleb stood on the porch, arms resting on the railing, eyes scanning the distance one last time. Still no rain, and still no sign of anything coming. But tomorrow someone would arrive. A stranger. A woman who believed there was something worth coming to. Caleb shook his head slightly. She'll learn, he said quietly. The wind answered back. Low, endless, unmoved, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't even bother looking up, because somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how. Morning came without ceremony. No birds sang, no rooster crowed, just the same restless wind dragging itself across the land like it had nowhere better to be. Caleb Turner was already awake. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floorboards as pale light crept through the cracks in the wall. Sleep had come in pieces, short, uneasy, and filled with things he didn't care to remember. Today was the day. And he knew it without needing to look at the calendar. Easter Sunday. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile. Figures, he muttered. Of all days. He stood slowly, joints stiff, and reached for his hat. The room was small, bare, stripped down to what a man needed and nothing more. A bed, a wash basin, a chair that had seen better years, and silence. Always silence. Outside, the ranch stretched wide and weary beneath the early light. From a distance, it might have looked peaceful. Open land, endless sky, the kind of place folks in town romanticized when they talked about starting fresh. Up close, it told the truth. The fences leaned like tired men. The barn wore its age openly, wood split and sun-bleached. The fields, once proud and green, had turned brittle, knowing the soil cracked into jagged patterns that spoke of months without rain. Caleb stepped off the porch and paused. He took it all in like he did every morning. Not because it changed, but because he needed to remind himself what he was up against. A low sound drew his attention. One of the cows stood near the far post, its head lowered, chewing slowly on nothing in particular. Too thin, too quiet. Caleb walked over, boots kicking up dust. You're hanging on, he said almost to himself. The animal blinked, indifferent. Guess that makes two of us. Work filled the morning the way it always did. Heavy, repetitive, necessary. Caleb checked the troughs, nearly dry. He hauled what little water he could from the well, the rope creaking in protest as the bucket scraped along the sides. When it came up, the water inside was murky, barely enough to keep things going. He poured it anyway. There wasn't another option. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, pressing heat into the land like a weight. Caleb wiped his brow with the back of his hand and moved toward the fields. Rows of failed crops stretched out before him. Corn that never fully grew, wheat that withered before harvest. Every inch of soil seemed to carry the same message. Not this year. Caleb crouched, running his fingers over the dirt. Dry. Lifeless. He picked up a handful and let it fall slowly through his fingers, watching as the wind carried it away. There was a time, he started, then stopped. No point finishing that sentence. There were a lot of things there used to be. Around noon, Caleb retreated to the shade of the barn. Inside, it smelled of hay and old wood, a scent that used to bring comfort. Now it just reminded him of how much had changed. His eyes drifted to a corner where a few tools were stacked neatly. Not his doing. She had organized them that way, years ago. He walked over, almost without thinking, and picked up a small hammer. The handle was worn smooth, shaped by hands that had cared enough to keep things in order, even when the world outside wasn't. Caleb swallowed. Still keeping things together, huh? He murmured. But there was no answer. There never was. By the time afternoon rolled in, the sky had turned a dull, washed-out blue. No clouds, no promise. Caleb leaned against the fence line, eyes fixed on the distant road that cut through the plains like a scar. That's where she'd come from. The woman, the bride, the stranger. He shifted his weight, now uncomfortable with the thought. He hadn't told anyone the full truth. Not Dawkins, not the folks in town, because saying it out loud would make it real. This wasn't about companionship. It wasn't about love. It was about survival. He needed hands, help, someone who could keep the house running while he fought to keep the land from slipping through his fingers. That's all. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. But something about the timing unsettled him. Easter, of all days. A day people talked about new beginnings, about life returning where there had been none. Caleb exhaled slowly. I ain't looking for beginnings, he said under his breath. Just trying to hold on. The hours stretched long and quiet. Every now and then, Caleb would glance toward the road, then look away again. He didn't expect much, didn't want to, because expecting things had a way of breaking a man. Still, as the sun began its slow descent, something shifted. A faint sound, distant, rhythmic. Caleb straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the horizon. There, barely visible through the haze of dust. Movement. A shape forming against the empty road. Horse and carriage. Coming his way. Caleb's jaw tightened. Well, he said quietly, guess it's time. He adjusted his hat, squaring his shoulders, not out of confidence, but out of habit. Whatever was coming fast, and for the first time in a long while. Something on that horizon wasn't just emptiness, but whether it brought salvation or something else entirely. Caleb Turner had yet to find out. The sound reached him before the sight did. A steady rhythm against the earth, wooden wheels turning, on hooves pressing into dry ground. It cut through the silence of Black Hollow like something foreign, something out of place. Caleb stood near the fence, unmoving, watching, waiting. The stagecoach emerged slowly through the veil of dust, its outline sharpening with every passing second. The horses were tired. He could see that much already, but they pressed on, as if they knew their journey was nearly over. Caleb adjusted his hat, his expression unreadable. So, she came. The words felt strange in his mouth. For a moment, he wondered if she'd turn back, if something along the way would have convinced her this was a mistake. But the coach didn't slow, didn't hesitate. It rolled straight toward him. By the time it reached the front of the ranch, the wind had picked up again, swirling dust around the wheels as they came to a creaking stop. Now, the driver climbed down first, stretching his back with a groan. This Turner place? He called out. Caleb stepped forward. That depends who's asking. The driver gave a half smile. Got a delivery. Caleb didn't return the smile. Not a package, the man added, nodding toward the coach door. A person. There was a pause. Then, the door opened. She stepped down carefully, one hand gripping the side of the coach, the other holding onto a small, worn trunk. For a brief moment, the wind seemed to quiet. Her boots touched the ground gently, like she wasn't trying to disturb anything. She stood still after that, taking in her surroundings, not with fear, but with something else. Something calmer. Stronger. Caleb studied her. She wasn't what he expected. No flashy dress, no nervous fidgeting, no wide-eyed panic at the sight of his broken-down ranch. Just a simple, modest outfit. Dust from the journey clung to the hem, but she didn't seem bothered by it. Her gaze moved slowly from the barn to the fields to the cattle, seeing everything, understanding more than most would at a glance. Then her eyes found him, and she smiled. Not a forced smile, not polite, real. Caleb shifted slightly, caught off guard. You Caleb Turner? She asked. Her voice was soft, but steady. He nodded once. That's me. She stepped closer, setting her trunk down beside her. Mary Beth Hale, she said. It's good to finally meet you. Caleb glanced at the trunk, then back at her. That all you brought? Mary Beth followed his gaze, then nodded. It's enough. He let out a quiet breath through his nose. Hope you weren't expecting much, he said, eye gesturing loosely toward the ranch. This is it. Mary Beth turned again, taking it all in a second time. The broken fences, The dry land, the tired animals, the house that had seen too many hard years. And still, she didn't flinch. "I wasn't called here for much," she said gently. "I was called here for this." Caleb frowned slightly. "Called?" he repeated. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." There was no explanation after that, no long speech. Just a quiet certainty in her eyes that made Caleb uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. He looked away first. "Well," he said gruffly, "you're here now." The driver cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "I'll be heading out. Got another stop before nightfall." Caleb nodded and handed over a few coins. More than he could afford, but not enough to argue over. Now, the driver tipped his hat to Mary Beth. "Ma'am!" Then he climbed back up, flicked the reins, and just like that, the coach was gone. Dust rose behind it, swallowing the road until it looked like no one had ever been there at all. Silence settled in again. Only now. It felt different. Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly aware that he wasn't alone anymore. "Well," he said after a moment, "house is that way." Mary Beth picked up her trunk without complaint. "I can manage," she said. He watched her for a second, then turned and started walking, expecting her to follow. She did. Inside, the house felt smaller with another presence in it. Caleb set his hat on the table and gestured toward the space. "Ain't much," he said, "but it'll keep the wind out." Mary Beth stepped in slowly, her eyes moving across the room. She noticed everything, nay, in the single chair, the worn table, the untouched corner where dust had settled thicker than the rest. And then, her gaze lingered on something Caleb hadn't expected her to notice. A faded piece of fabric, folded neatly on a shelf. A woman's shawl. Mary Beth didn't ask about it, didn't touch it. But something in her expression softened. "I'll make it home," she said quietly. Caleb stiffened slightly. "It already is," he replied, a little too quickly. Mary Beth didn't argue. The rest of the afternoon passed in an unfamiliar rhythm. She unpacked quietly, moved with purpose, cleaned without being asked. Caleb watched from a distance more than once, unsure what to make of her. Most people talked to fill silence. She didn't. Most people asked questions. She didn't. And yet, her presence spoke louder than either. As evening settled in, and the sky dimmed into shades of gold and gray, Caleb stood on the porch again, like he always did. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Mary Beth stepped out beside him, her hands resting lightly in front of her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently across the land, the same broken pieces, and yet, something about it felt different. Caleb glanced at her. "You really believe you were called here?" he asked. Mary Beth looked out over the horizon. "I do." He studied her, searching for doubt. He didn't find any. "What if you're wrong?" he pressed. She turned to him then, her expression calm but certain. "Then I'll still do what I came to do." Caleb let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. "You're either brave," he muttered, "then or you don't know what you walked into." Mary Beth's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe both." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ranch. Caleb looked out at the land again. Same dust, same silence, same struggle waiting for him in the morning. But now, there was someone else standing in it with him. He didn't know if that was a good thing. Didn't know if it would change anything. Didn't know if she'd last a week. But as the last light of day faded, one thought crossed his mind, quiet, unwelcome, but persistent. Maybe, just maybe. She didn't come here by accident. The first thing Mary Beth noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that settles over a place at the end of a long, honest day. This silence felt strained, like the land itself was holding its breath. Morning came gently, with pale light stretching across the plains. Mary Beth was already awake before the sun fully rose, sitting at the small wooden table with her hands folded loosely in front of her. The house was still. Caleb hadn't stirred yet. She glanced around again, taking in what she had only briefly seen the day before. Now, in the quiet of morning, every detail spoke louder. The dust gathered in corners, not from laziness, but from exhaustion. The worn edges of the furniture, not from neglect, but from years of use without replacement. And the emptiness, not just of objects, but of presence. This had once been a home. Now, it was something closer to survival. Maribeth stood slowly and moved toward the window. Outside, the land stretched wide and dry, the early light revealing every crack in the soil like lines on a weary face. She placed her hand lightly against the glass. "Not beyond saving," she whispered. Behind her, floorboards creaked. "Caleb." "You always up this early?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. Maribeth turned, offering a small smile. "It's a good time to listen." Caleb frowned slightly. "Listen to what?" She tilted her head just a little. "What's been ignored?" He gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Out here, that'd be everything." Maribeth didn't argue. Instead, she reached for a small cloth and began wiping down the table. Not hurried, not performative. Just intentional. Caleb watched her for a moment before grabbing his hat. "I'll be outside," he muttered. "I'll join you," she replied. The air carried a bit of coolness as they stepped out, but it wouldn't last long. The sun was already climbing, ash preparing to press its weight onto the land again. Maribeth paused just outside the door. She didn't move right away. Instead, she looked. Really looked. Her eyes traced the lines of the fence, the sagging points where the wood leaned too far. She followed the slope of the land, noting how the ground dipped slightly toward the far end of the property. Then, she turned toward the cattle. Too thin, too slow, not just hungry, strained. Caleb noticed her stillness. "Well," he said, "you've seen it now." Maribeth nodded. "I have." "And?" he pressed. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped off the porch and began walking. Not toward the barn, not toward the house, but toward the fields. Caleb hesitated, then followed. The soil crunched beneath their boots as they crossed into what used to be farmland. Maribeth crouched, now pressing her fingers into the earth, dry at the surface. But as she dug slightly deeper, her expression shifted. Caleb crossed his arms. "You won't find much." Maribeth didn't look up. "No," she said softly, "but I found something." That caught his attention. "What?" She stood, brushing her hands lightly against her skirt. "There's moisture beneath this layer," she explained. "Not enough for crops the way you've been planting, but enough to work with." Caleb shook his head. "Doesn't matter what's under it if it won't reach the roots." Maribeth met his gaze. "Unless we help it." He let out a breath, already turning away. "I've tried digging, tried rotating crops, tried everything folks in town suggested." "Suggested," she repeated gently. Caleb stopped. Something in her tone made him turn back. "You say that like it's the problem." Maribeth walked a few steps further, her eyes scanning the land again. "You've been reacting," she said, "not observing." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She pointed toward the slight slope she had noticed earlier. "Water doesn't stay where it falls," she said. "It moves, always." Caleb followed her gesture. "There hasn't been rain," he replied flatly. Maribeth nodded. "Not enough. But when it does come, even briefly, it's not being kept." That made him pause. He hadn't thought of it that way. "Your land isn't empty," she continued. "It's misused." The word hit sharper than she intended. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You just got here." "And I'm seeing it clearly," she said, not unkindly. They stood in silence for a moment. The wind moved around them, quieter now, as if listening too. Finally, Caleb spoke. "So what? You think you can fix it?" Maribeth's gaze softened. "I think it can be restored." He let out a short laugh. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's better." They spent the next hour walking the land. Maribeth asked a few questions, but each one mattered. "Where does the water collect when it rains? Which part dries first? Have you noticed where the grass lasts the longest?" Caleb answered slowly at first, then with more thought. He found himself remembering things he hadn't paid attention to in years. Small details, patterns, clues. By the time they reached the far end of the property, something had shifted. Not in the land, but in him. Mary Beth stopped near a shallow dip in the earth. This is where we start, she said. Caleb looked around. Start what? A channel, she replied. To guide the water when it comes? He stared at her. You're talking about changing the land. Mary Beth shook her head gently. No, she said. I'm talking about working with it. Back at the house, the sun had climbed high, and the heat settled in thick and unrelenting. Caleb leaned against the porch railing, watching as Mary Beth set her small notebook on the table and began sketching something. Lines, curves, plans. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Mary Beth paused, then nodded. My father taught me, she said. He believed land speaks, if you know how to listen. Caleb glanced out at the dry fields again. All I've heard is silence. Mary Beth followed his gaze. Sometimes silence, she said quietly, is just waiting to be understood. Later that evening, as the sky softened into shades of amber and gray, Caleb stood alone for a moment. He looked out over his ranch, same broken fences, same tired ground, same uncertain future. But now, there were lines drawn in his mind where there hadn't been before. Paths, possibilities. He exhaled slowly. Stewardship, he muttered, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. It wasn't about forcing the land, not anymore. It was about caring for it, guiding it, trusting that something beneath the surface still had life left to give. Behind him, Mary Beth stepped quietly onto the porch. She didn't speak, didn't need to, because for the first time since she arrived, Caleb wasn't just seeing what was lost. He was beginning to see what remained. And sometimes, that's where restoration begins. The sky had been threatening all afternoon, not with rain, just weight. Heavy clouds stretched thin across the horizon, like they wanted to gather but couldn't quite find the strength. The air felt different, thicker somehow, but the ground remained just as dry, just as unforgiving. Caleb noticed it. He always noticed. But he didn't say anything, because noticing and believing were two very different things. The work Mary Beth had started was already changing the shape of the land. Not in ways most people would see, not yet. But Caleb could. Shallow trenches carved carefully along the slope, stones placed with intention, small diversions where water, if it ever came, might be guided instead of lost. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't miraculous. It was patient. And somehow, that made it harder to trust. By late afternoon, Caleb's shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat and dust. He drove the shovel into the ground harder than necessary, each strike carrying more frustration than the last. Mary Beth noticed. She set down the bundle of sticks she had been gathering and walked closer, her steps steady, unhurried. You're fighting it, she said. Caleb didn't look up. I'm working. No, she replied gently. You're resisting. That did it. He jammed the shovel into the dirt and straightened, turning toward her with a sharp edge in his voice. You've been here, what, 2 days? He snapped. And suddenly you know everything about this land? About me? Mary Beth didn't step back, didn't raise her voice. I know what I see, she said. And what's that? He challenged. She held his gaze. A man who's already decided this won't work. The words landed harder than he expected. Caleb let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. You think that's unreasonable? He said. So look around. He gestured wide, his voice rising. This land's been dying for years. I've tried everything I know, everything I can do, and it hasn't been enough. His chest rose and fell heavier now, the frustration no longer contained. And now you come in here, he continued, talking about restoration like it's just a matter of digging a few lines in the dirt and saying the right words. It's not the dirt you don't trust, Mary Beth said quietly. Caleb stopped. The wind seemed to pause with him. What? He said, lower now. Mary Beth took a step closer, her voice steady but filled with something deeper. It's not the land you've given up on, she said. It's God. Silence fell between them. Sharp, unavoidable. Caleb's expression hardened instantly, something guarded rising up behind his eyes. Don't, he said. Mary Beth didn't retreat. You stopped believing he could restore anything, she continued softly. I said don't. His voice was firmer now. But she pressed on, not with force, but with truth. You've been carrying this alone for so long that trusting again feels more dangerous than failing. That was it. Something inside him snapped. Caleb turned away, running a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps like he needed distance. But there was nowhere to go. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. Marybeth's voice followed him. Then help me understand. He stopped, his back still to her. For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind picked up again, brushing past them like a restless witness. And then, slowly, Caleb spoke. I prayed, he said. The words were rough, unpracticed. Back then, I prayed every day. He turned slightly, saw, though he still couldn't quite face her. For rain, for the crops, for the cattle. His jaw tightened. For her. Marybeth didn't interrupt, didn't move. They said it was just a fever, he continued, his voice quieter now. Said she'd be fine. A pause, and I believe that. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I trusted that. The wind carried a faint echo of something distant, but neither of them looked away from the moment unfolding between them. And then one morning, he swallowed hard. She just didn't wake up. The words fell heavy, final. Marybeth's eyes softened, but she remained silent, because this wasn't something to be interrupted. Caleb finally turned to face her fully, and for the first time, the anger wasn't what showed. It was something deeper, something raw. I did everything right, he said, his voice breaking just slightly. I believed. I prayed. I trusted. His eyes searched hers, not for answers, but for something that made sense. And it didn't matter. The wind moved again, softer now, almost like it was listening. Marybeth stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. It mattered. Caleb shook his head immediately. No, it didn't. It mattered, she repeated, firmer now. Just not in the way you expected. He looked at her like she'd said something impossible. How is that supposed to make sense? He demanded. It doesn't, she admitted. Not always. A tear slipped down Caleb's cheek before he could stop it. He didn't wipe it away, didn't try to hide it, because whatever walls he'd built, they were cracking now. I lost everything, he said quietly. Marybeth shook her head gently. No, she said. You didn't lose everything. He let out a hollow breath. Feels like I did. She looked at him, not with pity, but with certainty. You're still here, she said. And so is this land. Caleb's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of everything finally settling in a way he couldn't push away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Marybeth lowered herself to her knees. Right there in the dirt. Caleb stared at her. What are you doing? He asked, his voice barely steady. She looked up at him. Inviting you to stop carrying this alone. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to walk away, to shut it down, to bury it again. But something else, something quieter, held him there. Marybeth didn't rush him, didn't push. She simply waited. The wind softened, the sky dimmed, and for the first time in years, Caleb Turner felt the weight of his own resistance. Not the land, not the drought, not the loss. Him. Slowly, reluctantly. He took a step forward, then another, and then he dropped to his knees beside her. The ground was hard beneath him, uncomfortable, unfamiliar. But he stayed. At first, he didn't know what to say. The words felt distant, foreign, like something he had forgotten how to use. Marybeth bowed her head gently, and after a long silence, Caleb did the same. I don't, he started, his voice shaking, then stopped, tried again. I don't know if you're listening. The words were simple, unpolished, real. But I can't do this anymore. His hands pressed into the dirt beneath him. I tried on my own. A breath, uneven. And it's not enough. The wind moved around them, now quieter than it had been all day. Not gone, just gentler. I'm tired, Caleb whispered, of fighting, of holding on to something that keeps falling apart. A pause, then, softer still. If you're still there, his voice nearly gave out. I need help. Silence followed, but it didn't feel empty. Not this time. Mary Beth didn't speak, didn't need to, because something had already changed. Not the sky, not the land, not the circumstances waiting for them tomorrow, but Caleb. He lifted his head slowly, breathing deeper than he had in a long time. The weight wasn't gone, but it wasn't crushing him the same way. He glanced at Mary Beth. "You really think this changes anything?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze with a calm, steady confidence. "I think it changes everything," she said. Far off in the distance, a low rumble echoed across the plains. Not loud, not certain. But there, Caleb looked toward the horizon. Clouds had begun to gather. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. He didn't smile, didn't speak. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't look away. Because something inside him had finally turned back. The night after Caleb knelt in the dirt, the world didn't change. At least, not in the way he might have expected. There was no sudden downpour, no booming voice from the heavens, no miracle that erased years of struggle in a single moment. Morning came just the same. Dry wind, pale sky, the same stretch of stubborn land waiting outside his door. But something had changed. Caleb felt it before he even opened his eyes. A stillness, not around him, within him. He sat up slowly, resting his hands on his knees, just like he had the morning before. But this time, he wasn't staring at the floor like a man with nothing left. He was thinking about the land, about the trenches, about the way water might move if it were given a path, and about the words he had spoken the night before. "I can't do this alone." He exhaled slowly. "Guess we'll see," he murmured. Outside, Mary Beth was already at work. Caleb spotted her near the far slope, adjusting one of the shallow channels they had started. Her movements were deliberate, never rushed, never wasted. He grabbed his hat and headed toward her. "You missed a turn here," he said, nodding toward the line she was tracing in the dirt. Mary Beth glanced up, surprised but pleased. "Did I?" she asked. Caleb stepped forward, crouching down as he studied the ground. "If water comes from that direction," he said, pointing toward the higher ridge, "it'll run too fast. You'll lose half of it before it settles." Mary Beth watched him closely. "And your solution?" He reached for a stick and drew a curve in the soil. "Slow it here," he said. "Guide it wider. Let it sink instead of rush." A small smile touched her lips. "You're learning to listen." Caleb didn't look at her. "Just paying attention," he muttered. But there was no edge in his voice this time. The hours passed differently that day. Still hard, still tiring, but different. They worked together now, not side by side in silence, but in rhythm. Adjusting, testing, observing. The land hadn't changed yet, but the way they worked with it had. By midday, the air grew heavier, not hotter, heavier. Caleb paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he looked up at the sky. Clouds. Real ones this time. Not the thin, scattered kind that drifted by without purpose. These were gathering, layering, building. Mary Beth noticed his stillness. "You see it too," she said. Caleb nodded slowly. "Yeah." But he didn't say more. Didn't let himself. Because he had seen clouds before. And clouds didn't always mean rain. The first drop came quietly. So quietly Caleb almost thought he imagined it. A soft tap against the dry earth. Then another. Mary Beth held still, her face tilted slightly upward. Neither of them spoke, because both of them knew moments like this were fragile. Then, more. Not heavy, not rushing, just steady. Gentle drops falling one after the other, darkening the soil in scattered patches. Caleb stepped forward, his boots pressing into ground that had known nothing but dryness for far too long. He looked down as a drop hit the back of his hand, then another, and another. "It's raining," he said. The words sounded unfamiliar, like something he hadn't said in years. Mary Beth smiled, her eyes shining, not with surprise, but with quiet gratitude. "Yes," she said softly. "It is. The rain didn't pour. It didn't need to. Because this time, the land was ready. Caleb turned toward the slope instinctively. Water was already beginning to move, thin streams forming where there had been none before. He watched closely, watched as it followed the paths they had carved, slowing where he had widened the trench, pooling where Mary Beth had reinforced the edges with stone, not rushing away, not disappearing, staying. A breath caught in his chest. "Look at that," he whispered. Mary Beth stepped beside him. "It's working," she said. But Caleb shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, his voice filled with something deeper. "We're working." The rain continued for nearly an hour. Just enough. Just steady enough. By the time it stopped, the ground had changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. The cracks hadn't vanished. The land wasn't suddenly green, but the soil held moisture now. Real moisture. Life had something to reach for again. Caleb walked slowly through the field, his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. He crouched, pressing his hand into the soil. Cool, damp, alive. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. For the first time in years. This didn't feel like the end. Behind him, Mary Beth approached quietly. "There's more work ahead," she said gently. Caleb nodded. "I know." He stood looking out across the land. "We're not done." "No," she agreed. "But we've begun." He glanced at her then, really looking this time. "You knew this would happen?" he asked. Mary Beth shook her head. "I trusted it could." Caleb looked back at the sky. The clouds were already beginning to thin, sunlight breaking through in soft beams that stretched across the land like quiet promises. He thought about the night before, about the words he had spoken, about the weight he had finally set down, and about this moment, this rain, this beginning. "You ever notice," he said slowly, "how things don't change all at once?" Mary Beth smiled faintly. "They're not meant to." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady now. "Guess I was waiting for something big," he admitted. Yet Mary Beth's voice was soft beside him. "Sometimes the biggest things," she said, "start small." The wind moved gently across the land again, but it didn't feel restless anymore. It felt renewed. Caleb adjusted his hat, his posture straighter than it had been in a long time. "All right," he said. "What's next?" Mary Beth looked out over the ranch, her eyes thoughtful. "Now," she said, "we build on what we've been given." Caleb nodded once, firm, certain. And as he stepped forward, back into the work waiting for him, there was no hesitation in his stride, because the rain hadn't just touched the land, it had reached something deeper, and what had once been dry and lifeless was finally beginning to grow again. By the time summer came, Black Hollow didn't look the same. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough that folks riding past slowed down, and sometimes they stopped. Where there had once been nothing but brittle earth and stubborn dust, patches of green now pushed their way through the soil. Not perfect rows, not yet, but growing. Alive. The fences stood straighter. The barn, though still worn, had been reinforced where it mattered most. And the cattle, once little more than bone and breath, had begun to fill out again, their movements steadier, their heads lifting higher as they grazed. It wasn't a miracle you could point to in a single moment. It was something quieter, something built. Caleb stood at the edge of the field one early morning, the sun rising slow and warm behind him. He rested his hands on the fence post, his gaze stretching across the land. His land. But it didn't feel like something he was fighting anymore. Yes, it felt like something he was tending, caring for, walking alongside. "You're up earlier than usual." Mary Beth's voice came from behind him. Caleb glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Could say the same to you." She stepped beside him, her dress brushing lightly against the tall grass that had finally begun to take root near the fence line. For a while they just stood there. No rush, no urgency, just presence. "It's different," Caleb said after a moment. Mary Beth nodded. "It is." He exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the fields again. "I used to wake up expecting things to fall apart," he admitted. A pause. "Now, I wake up wondering what's going to grow." Mary Beth's smile deepened, but she didn't speak. Because she knew. That shift meant more than anything they could see. The town noticed, too. Word had spread, as it always did. First, as curiosity, then as disbelief, and finally, as quiet respect. Old Mr. Dawkins rode by one afternoon, slowing his horse just like he had before. But this time, his eyes lingered longer on the land. Well, he muttered, shaking his head slightly. Caleb leaned casually against the fence. Stranger things have happened, he said. Dawkins gave him a sideways glance. Yeah, he replied. Guess they have. His gaze shifted toward Mary Beth, who was kneeling near one of the channels, adjusting a line of stones. She the reason for all this? Caleb followed his gaze. For a moment, he considered the question. Then he shook his head. She's part of it, he said. Dawkins raised an eyebrow. And the other part? Caleb's expression grew quieter. Learning I wasn't meant to carry it alone. That evening, now the sky stretched wide and golden, the kind of sunset that didn't ask for attention, but held it anyway. Caleb sat on the porch, his hat resting beside him, his elbows on his knees. Mary Beth joined him a moment later, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him. Thank you, he said. She nodded. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that no longer felt heavy. You never told me, Caleb said eventually. Mary Beth glanced at him. Told you what? Why you came, he replied. Really? She looked out at the land, her expression thoughtful. I told you, she said gently. I was called. Caleb shook his head slightly. Yeah, but people say things like that. Mary Beth smiled faintly. I didn't come just because of a letter, she said, or an arrangement. She turned to him then. I prayed for direction, she continued. Damn, and this is where it led me. Caleb studied her face, searching for hesitation. There was none. You didn't know what you'd find, he said. No, she admitted. But I trusted who sent me. Caleb leaned back slightly, letting that settle. You ever doubt it? He asked. Marybeth's gaze softened. I trust more than I doubt, she said. Then, after a small pause, but I still choose it. Every day. The sun dipped lower, painting the land in warm light. Caleb looked out over everything again. The fields, the channels, the life returning, one piece at a time. And then, he spoke. I used to think redemption was something that just happened, he said. Marybeth listened. Like a moment, he continued. A single change that fixed everything. He shook his head slowly. But it's not, is it? Marybeth's voice was gentle. No, she said. It's a path. Caleb nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. A path. He picked up his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. You know, he added, I thought bringing you here was about saving this ranch. Marybeth raised an eyebrow slightly. And now? He looked at her, really looked. It wasn't the ranch that needed saving, he said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marybeth smiled, not wide, not loud, just certain. A breeze moved through the grass, softer now than it had ever been, carrying the scent of earth that had finally begun to heal. Caleb, she said after a while. He glanced at her. What happens next? He looked out at the horizon, where the last light of day lingered just a little longer, then back at the land, then at her. And for the first time, the answer came without hesitation. We keep going, he said, and the stars began to appear one by one, scattered across the darkening sky. And beneath them, a ranch that had once been given up for dead, now stood breathing again. Not perfect, not finished, but restored in the way that mattered most. Because redemption hadn't come all at once. It hadn't arrived like thunder, or forced its way through broken ground. It came quietly, through patience, through faith, through surrender, through work. And sometimes it arrived in the form of a stranger on an Easter morning, reminding a man that what was once lost was never beyond being found.